Hello, everyone, and welcome to what is now our third early career talk as part of the Neurophilosophy of Free Will Consortium. And I think I'll let Tim Bain do the introductions from here. Please take it away.
Thanks very much, Uri. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jake and Polaris today. I'll start with Jake. Jake's a fourth-year PhD student at Chapman, working with Uri and Aaron. He uses a variety of experimental and computational techniques, and he's going to be talking about a number of those techniques today. You'll be hearing about them, to examine the role of consciousness in self-initiated action and the role of the way in which attention influences decision-making. It's pretty exciting work. The other speaker, the philosopher that will be joining Jake, is Polaris Koi. He's currently a researcher at the University of Turku in Finland, having defended his PhD last year. I believe it received the highest commendation for a doctorate that was available in the university, having been given only 3 times in the history of the department. He's been involved in a number of Templeton projects, including a project that Templeton funded on genetics and human agency. And Polaris has broad interest in philosophy and cognitive science. His current projects include work on public policy, on self-control, autism, and the role of attention in action. And it's the final topic that Polaris is going to be speaking to us about today. Just one introductory remark about how we're going to approach the Q&A. I'm happy to allow clarificatory questions as we go. Jake and Polaris are happy with that. But I will ask folks to make sure that they're short and that they are clarificatory. Any abuse of the system, I will deal with very harshly. And of course, there'll be a Q&A after Jake and Polaris have spoken. Feel free to put your questions in the chat function at the end, or as you go, I guess, and I can get you to read them out at the end, or the old-fashioned way of simply raising your hand. So that's all from me. Polaris is going to kick us off, I believe. Polaris, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. I'm just going to share my screen. Great. Okay, everything should be working nice and dandy. So when Jake and I began working together, we wanted our talk to do 2 things. We wanted to build on what we know best, which in my case would be self-control, and in Jake's case, that would be volition neuroscience. We soon discovered, though, that we shared a strong interest in the role of attentional processes in action, which we thought was an exciting topic that has received far too little attention, pun not intended. So no one is saying that attention would be irrelevant for volition, action, and free will, but research into how exactly it is that attentional mechanisms figure in volition, choice, and control remains sparse, even though the topic has gotten a boost from frameworks like predictive processing. So our talks will each focus on our ongoing work. So it's new and exciting stuff, not necessarily something that has been polished across multiple years. So Jake's talk will discuss some of his ongoing research, which deals with the role of attention in self-initiated action, whereas I, for my part, will talk about the role of attentional mechanisms in self-control. I'll particularly be talking a lot about the classic Michel experiments. So for most accounts, self-control is directed at impulses, desires, or behaviors, or the will. But I'm going to argue that rather than modulating those directly, self-control targets those only indirectly. And the more proximate target of self-control, I will claim, is salience. And different forms of self-control, ranging from situational strategies to intrapsychic strategies such as inhibitory control and the rehearsal of reasons, all target cue salience for my account, which in turn then impacts the behavioral outcome in this story. Rather than being a special case, I think the case of self-control points to something more general about willed agency, and that's why I'm going to nest my explorations of self-control into a broader picture of willed human agency. So I'll first present a broad strokes picture of what I think willed agency entails. I'll then dive into self-control and talk about its heterogeneity and also about the role of attention as a unifying aspect of those heterogeneous forms of self-control. And then in the end, I'll zoom back out to look into the upshots of this account of self-control for agency in general. So let's start with some big questions. I think the problem of free will can be unpacked into so many different questions. So I think it's good to start with how are we going to unpack it for now. So there's so many different ways to approach it, one of which would be asking whether there can be any uncaused causes. A very traditional approach would be asking to what extent our actions are predetermined by gods, planets, genes, or something to the effect. But I think for philosophers who are interested in agency and in the psychological aspects of agency, like myself, the big problem then is what exactly does willed human agency consist in? And then the multidisciplinary problem would be what sorts of biological processes and mechanisms are involved in that. And then the more strictly neuroscientific issue that I don't have that much to contribute to would be how do these processes and mechanisms implicated by willed human agency in fact operate? So what does willed human agency consist in? From much of neurophilosophy, if one was to make an educated guess based on what are the focuses of those various papers and books and all of the literature that has been coming out, an educated guess might be that willed human agency consists in volition and control. But I don't think that's all there is to it. So here's a schematic diagram of what I think the process of carrying out a willed action entails. It's an expanded version of something that Anne-Marie Callis and colleagues have articulated. So first of all, agents must generate options. In rich environments like ourselves, like the ones we live in, there are too many possible behavioral outputs for agents to make a choice among all of those. So agents must first generate a set of options out of this vast range of possibility. Second, agents make a selection among the options they have generated. And having made that selection, we then need to form an intention that is to be motivated by our choice. So for some accounts, these are one and the same thing, two sides of the same coin, whereas other accounts make a distinction between these two. And then having made a decision and formed an intention, there is action execution. So we need to actually carry that action out. Now, I presented these aspects of agency consequentially, but they don't necessarily occur one after another. It's an iterative process where we generate new options, reassess our choices, and reorient our behavior as we come by new input. Elizabeth Perez-Burrell-Haas's talk discussed a connected idea that is the online updating of behavior. And also Robin Waller in her talk suggested that intention plays a role in both the planning stages of agency and in action execution. So those are two examples of how it might not be that we get from one step to the second and then the third, but rather these different aspects can co-occur. There's an iterative character to them. So, and also this is not an exhaustive description of willed action, but I do think that any account of willed action that is missing one of these elements would be incomplete. Now, when we look into willed agency through the lens of volition, this is typically what we are focused on. So volition research, or for philosophers, research into intentionality are focused on how we make choices and how we come to be motivated by those choices. When we are interested in control, things get a tiny bit more heterogeneous, but this is typically what we have in mind. So for cognitive control, generally, cognitive control processes are implicated in a lot of option selection and also execution processes. And they also have a part in intention formation, whereas motor control belongs largely in the domain of execution. And this heterogeneity of where control is and what stage of the process of coming by a willed action control is associated with is reflected on our debates about the nature of self-control. So for self-control, there's quite some debate about whether self-control is about decisions, motivation, or execution, or all of those three. And for example, some hold that self-control problems amount to changing one's mind too readily, associating self-control with decision-making, whereas skill accounts of self-control, I reckon, extend it to the domain of execution. But we can leave all of that aside for now and just recall for the rest of the talk that not all control is self-control. So concepts like cognitive control, self-control, motor control, or just control simpliciter are sometimes used in overlapping ways, but they don't all mean the same thing. So self-control doesn't refer to just any control process. Rather, it refers specifically to control for the purpose of resolving motivational conflicts, such as a conflict between a larger later goal and a smaller sooner reward, or a conflict between an impulse and what you've chosen to do. So self-control in this sense is not needed when the agent's various aims and desires are not in conflict. So when I'm thirsty and going for a glass of water, I need motor control, I need cognitive guidance control and the like, but I don't need self-control unless there's some sort of a conflict about which beverage I'm going for after all. So with this in mind, let's dive into what self-control means. There are multiple accounts of self-control within philosophy and psychology, and a lot could be said about this debate, whether it's characterized by results or processes, whether it targets decisions or impulses or something else, and whether self-control is even a meaningful category. But I'm just going to cut to the chase and share my definition of self-control. And you can also see some references on this slide if you want to look up some of the debates. But I think it makes most sense to think of self-control as a heterogeneous set of processes and behaviors united by their behavioral function rather than by any specific mechanism, structure, or process. So my way to formulate the defining feature of self-control would be that self-control is that which is enacted to align one's behavior with intention in the face of competing motivation. And other similar functional accounts have been proposed by Al-Mealy, Neil Levy, and Till Vierkant, among others. So if these accounts are correct, then it follows that self-control can take many forms. For such accounts, inhibitory control is sometimes self-control because it fulfills a specific behavioral function, namely the steering of behavior to align it with intention in the face of a motivational conflict. And any other thing than inhibitory control can also be self-control for the very same reason, if it fulfills that same criterion. A taxonomy of self-control strategies by Duckworth, Gendler, and Rose illustrates the heterogeneity of processes that can subserve self-control in functional views. So they divide self-control strategies into intrapsychic strategies and situational strategies of self-control. And here are some more specific examples of what those strategies can entail. So intrapsychic strategies include response modulation, which includes inhibitory control. So you're trying to, say, cut down on sugar and you notice that your hand is going dangerously close to that box of chocolates that your family member has open on the coffee table, and you just pull your hand back. That would be like a response modulation type intrapsychic strategy, whereas attention deployment includes strategies that aim to direct your attention elsewhere, typically to avoid a salient cue to do something you don't want to do. So for example, you're trying to quit smoking and you're hankering for a cigarette. So you fire up Netflix to distract yourself from that craving. And then there's cognitive change, which includes the rehearsal of reasons and construal. So rehearsal of reasons just means reminding yourself of why you're committed to some intention and why you don't want to instead go down the path of that other conflicting motivation. And construal then means framing the situation in a new way. So for example, in the Michel experiments, children who construed of the marshmallow as a fluffy cloud delayed considerably longer than children who didn't, which indicates that their strategy of construing of the situation as not involving anything edible really helped them not eat it. And then there's situational strategies. So situation selection simply means avoiding going into a space where your conflicting motivations are likely to be more salient. So for example, you're trying to go vegan. So then when going for dinner with friends, maybe you don't reserve a table at your favorite steakhouse, even if they did have vegan options. Instead, you go to some other restaurants so that you won't be tempted to order your favorite steak. And situation modification then involves any and all strategies used to modify the situations we are currently in order to make them more conducive to sticking to our intentions instead of going with competing motivations. So for example, setting various kinds of cues and reminders, putting those sneakers by the door, or social strategies, leaning on your friends, family, colleagues to help remind you of what you've committed to. Okay, so of course, these different forms of self-control are realized by very different mechanisms. And since there are different sets of mechanisms underlying these different forms of self-control, then the range of relevant mechanisms and processes for self-control becomes increasingly broad. So for example, while some forms of self-control rely heavily on cognitive control, forms of self-control such as the rehearsal of reasons also involve evaluative capacities because you need to remember why you value some option over another and highlight that in your mind. And forms like construal also involve capacities like imagination. You're imagining that marshmallow to be a fluffy cloud rather than what it actually is. And for social strategies, language processing and other processes that underlie social interaction become involved in self-control. And this is exactly why some resist functional views of self-control, because they find this heterogeneity of underlying processes and mechanisms daunting, ludicrous, or unhelpful for scientific endeavors to understand self-control. But proponents of views like mine can simply say that it's important to specify exactly which form of self-control is being studied, and to take measures in the experimental setup to ensure that subjects actually engage in that form of self-control rather than another. So thinking of self-control in terms of multiple realizability then doesn't prevent us from seeking to understand specific mechanisms. It just makes self-control an umbrella construct. But it does give us a real practical problem though, which is the following. We have this fairly pedestrian observation that some people seem to do better in self-control than others. A range of experimental setups confirm this observation, from the Michaud delayed gratification studies to measures of trait self-control on self-report scales and observer report scales. And we likewise observe that our self-control can seem better on some days than it is on others. For example, that we're more likely to give in to impulses when we're feeling stressed or sad, or when we haven't slept well. But given that self-control takes such heterogeneous forms, how can there be interpersonal differences in self-control? How can this person do better at it than this guy here? Shouldn't differences in aptitude in some of these processes largely cancel each other out? If there is no single self-control mechanism, then it becomes really difficult to explain how can it be that somebody is really bad in self-control. Because you would expect that they compensate with the other mechanisms and processes. In my previous work, I've suggested that this has to do with differences in the accessibility of the various behaviors that make up self-control. I've written about this in a couple of articles, so I won't get into that in detail here. Instead, I'm going to look down a complementary way of explaining these differences. I'm going to say that there is a process or set of processes that does unite different forms of self-control after all, from using inhibitory control to rehearsing reasons, to construal, to asking for social support, to situation selection and modification. Now, such a broad set of behaviors is so expansive that no mechanism could be both dedicated self-control mechanism and general to all self-control. So what I submit is that there is no dedicated self-control mechanism. However, there is a set of mechanisms that is both general to self-control and plays a clear causal and explanatory role in self-control. And that would be mechanisms of attention. Attention enters into self-control processes at multiple junctions, yet the explanatory role of attention for self-control has bafflingly gone underexplored. So we are now moving to the latter part of this dive to self-control, to discussing the role of attention and salience in it. This is not an entirely new idea. One could even call me a traditionalist, because everyone here is familiar with the Michel delayed gratification paradigm, a classic experiment colloquially known as the marshmallow tests. These studies measured the length of time that children were able to delay a small immediately available reward and instead get a larger reward. Later longitudinal studies connected interpersonal differences in delay time to a range of variables in health, financial, and social outcomes. But while these studies were the seed of a subsequent boom of research in self-control, their initial aim, which was to study the role of attention in delay of gratification, did not experience such a surge of interest. Instead, self-control became associated with constructs like inhibitory control, executive function, and willpower, a research trend that culminated in the rise and fall of the ego depletion hypothesis. The role of attention in self-control was buried under an avalanche of studies on trait self-control, inhibitory control, and ego depletion. So what did Michel and colleagues initially find out? In Attention in Delay of Gratification from 1970, Michel and Ebbesen set out to study the mechanisms that mediate delayed gratification. They describe a research setup where preschool children waited for a delayed reward while another less preferred reward was immediately available. In the room with the children was either the immediate reward, the delayed reward, both rewards, or no rewards, which allowed for measuring the effect of situational salience on action selection in the delay of gratification paradigm. So what Michel and Ebbesen initially theorized was that keeping your eyes on the prize would help you delay. But contrary to that theorizing, reward salience turned out to be counterproductive. Children delayed less if the reward was salient. However, successful delayers manipulated the situation in such a way as to make the reward less salient, such as by closing their eyes or turning their back to the reward. In other words, Michel and colleagues found that successful delayers use strategies by which they modulate their overt actions, and these strategies crucially operate in part via attentional mechanisms. They're not reducible to attention alone, but also these strategies would not work without attentional mechanisms. So in philosopher speak, attentional processes seem necessary but not sufficient for self-control. This is a fairly simple observation, yet it can't be highlighted enough. I don't think even Michel highlighted it enough. In order to steer their actions, the children in the Michel experiments steered their attention, and more specifically, they used ingenious strategies to manipulate the salience of the cue to eat that marshmallow. And we don't need to just rely on a 50-year-old study in social psychology. There's some convergent evidence. For example, a study by Steinke and colleagues from 2017 who used a combination of gaze pattern analysis and fMRI data to demonstrate that success in delayed gratification wasn't fully predicted by the dynamics of the cognitive control network, but rather individual differences in success were also associated with differences in the salience networks of the brain. So the story I'm telling here is that this is roughly what happens when we use self-control. We identify a situation as one that requires self-control. We then modulate which environmental and endogenous cues are salient to us by a variety of strategies. So the strategies of self-control I described before, ranging from inhibitory control to the situational strategies, all either directly or indirectly modulate where our attention is and which cues we attend to. Our success in steering our overt actions will then depend, other things being equal, on how successful we are in steering our attention. In some of my previous work, I've discussed interpersonal differences in self-control. talked about how we use a variety of self-control strategies, some of which are better suited for some people than they are for others. In particular, many intrapsychic strategies are difficult for people with executive functioning differences, whether due to a sleepless night or due to psychopathology. But here I'm interested in the other side of the coin. Under this heterogeneity of strategies and under these marked interpersonal differences in which strategies we gravitate to, and which strategies work well for us in our various life situations, there is a commonality, there's a common thread. Attentional mechanisms impacting cue salience are implicated in almost all self-control, regardless of which strategy is being used. Almost all, because I found a counterexample and I invite you to ask about it in the Q&A. Okay, so if what I'm saying here is correct, then the direct target of self-control is no impulse, desire, or behavior. Rather, those are indirect targets only. A more proximate target, and in some cases, a direct target of self-control is cue salience. And cue salience, in turn, then impacts behavior. And because cue salience impacts behavior unreliably, that can help explain why sometimes even the most ardent efforts in self-control fail to produce self-control success. Okay, so it's time to zoom back out and to take stock on the options of this idea for agency in general. I've said that self-control operates by modulating cue salience. Is self-control special in this regard? I don't see any reason why it would be. Rather, wouldn't it make sense that agents would use similar means to steer their behavior, regardless of whether or not they are facing a motivational conflict, as in the case of self-control, or whether they are enacting any other sorts of non-automatic actions? Okay, so attentional processes play a large role in action execution, particularly for skillful and extended agency that requires that attention is modulated in an appropriate way. This harkens again back to a previous talk where Sam Ray's example was having the plan of picking up books from the library upon passing the library. Yet sometimes you might be lost in thought and walk right past the library. So to steer our behavior to successfully go to that library, we need to make sure that our attention is on the cue at an appropriate time. So in order to successfully carry out any non-automatic actions, attentional processes need to be appropriately deployed. We deploy those processes to modulate the salience of cues, such as, oh, there's a library, right, I was supposed to pick up those books, to steer behavior generally, and not just in motivational conflicts. As for selecting among a set of options, there's plenty of research in the behavioral sciences that points towards that we tend to choose the most salient option, even if other things are not quite equal. This has been known by people in marketing for quite a while, and it's now the basis for the use of behavioral interventions such as nudges in public policy. Again, our attention pulls our choices when we select from a set of options. Salience also plays a large part in determining whether a plan moves us. If you've ever had the experience of being totally engrossed in a project, so that your attention is quite captivated by it, which is an incredibly motivating experience. And then due to some sort of a scheduling nuisance, you have to switch to a different task. And even if you think that other task is just as valuable as the one that you were currently up to, it can be really hard to switch to doing that other thing and quite unmotivating. So other things being equal or even a little bit less than equal, we tend to be moved to act on the things that are most salient to us. And finally, in rich environments, it's the salience networks that ultimately determine which features of our situation we attend to at a given time. And we can only generate action options based on what we attend to. And this is why modulating cue salience is so crucial for self-control and for willed action in general. Okay, so in the beginning of my talk, I asked some big questions. I asked what exactly does willed human agency consist in, what sorts of biological processes and mechanisms underlie willed human agency, and also I wondered how these processes and mechanisms in fact operate. If the picture I'm sketching here is correct, then willed human agency doesn't just consist in volition and control, it also crucially consists in attention. And correspondingly, some of the biological processes and mechanisms we need to look at in order to understand the biological underpinnings of agency are processes of attention and salience. I reckon we should be doing more of that, even if just to prove me wrong. So what I've offered today is the following. It can appear like the heterogeneity of self-control behaviors blocks discovering processes that are general to self-control. But if I'm right, then attentional mechanisms are roughly general to self-control, particularly as self-control operates by modulating cue salience. I've also suggested a robust role for attention in agency. If that suggestion turns out to be right, then it's puzzling that there is so little research into the role of attentional processes in action. Okay, so what I've said about agency more generally is not terribly satisfying. It's very broad strokes, and it's not very satisfying for me. It's more of a research agenda than an answer to any question, but there are offshoots that we can glean from it, even in this broad strokes state. Namely, given the robust role of attentional processes in action, I don't believe that we can end up with an accurate picture of agency without accounting for the role of attention in it. And one open question that should concern us is, how would properly accounting for the role of attention influence what we think about volition and control? Would they turn out to be less important, or might even some aspects of agency that we have been ascribing to volition and control turn out to flow from attentional processes rather than volitional processes? I'm going to hand it over to Jake next, and he offers something a bit more satisfying in my opinion. So he's going to talk about his ongoing research combining volition neuroscience with pupil dilations. I think that research is a wonderful example of what accounting for the role of attention in action can look like in practice. Thank you for your attention.
So I will take it over now. Go ahead and get this set up. There we go. So I'm going to be taking over. Actually, quickly, can you all hear me? Yes? Great. So I'm going to be taking it over for Polaris here and handling the neuroscience side of these joint talks, or of our joint talk. And whereas Polaris talked more about self-control directly, about the heterogeneity and multiple realizability of self-control, basically how self-control can be actualized or realized in multiple different ways, and the role of salience in successfully realizing self-control, I'm going to be talking more about self-initiated action, then talking about this specific attentional process called reorienting that we're looking at during self-initiated action. And then at the end, I'm going to bring it back to inhibitory control and make some claims about what Polaris has said, generally in alignment with him. So first things first, though, if there's anything that you are going to take away from our talk today, it's that attention plays a crucial role, not just in perception, where it's historically found its main home, but attention also plays a crucial role in behavior, decision-making. And it has gone understudied in both the self-control fields and the volition fields. And our goal is to talk about what role it might play and then give some evidence for what's going on in terms of attention in volition and self-control. So my talk is really going to be centered around 4 questions that you might have, or you might find yourself having after I tell you them. The first question is just, what is attention anyway, and how does it work in the brain? It's too big of a concept to give a full answer to this, but I'm going to give some overview and some specific details on reorienting. The second question is, how does attention fit in with self-initiated and volitional actions? There has been very few studies that look directly at attention in self-initiated actions, so I want to give a little bit of an overview of what we've done there. Then I want to talk about, well, we ask, how does attention relate to the neural correlates of volition, to what exists in the literature already in terms of brain activity that relates to volitional decision-making. And then finally, how does attention relate to self-control? And I'm going to give a little bit of preliminary data and findings with regards to that question. So we'll first talk about what is attention in the first place. It's simultaneously something that everyone kind of knows what it is, but refers actually to a constellation, a whole group of different cognitive capacities and abilities. So we might refer to attention in the way of, like I'm sitting at my laptop, typing or writing a paper, and I'm directing my attention towards one sentence and then another, and then maybe making something bold or italic. And I'm engaging attention in this very goal-directed manner. But we might also talk about attention in the sense of, I'm doing this, and then I hear a loud crash or someone yelling my name. And in that case, attention refers to this process of whatever I'm doing, my attention being grabbed away from that and directed towards this novel stimulus. So the important thing to note is that this umbrella term of attention refers to these different capacities, and these different capacities are handled by different brain regions and different brain networks especially. I'm going to focus on two of them, the ventral attention network and the dorsal attention network. So the ventral attention network handles this second capacity that I talked about, where you hear or see or somehow experience an unexpected stimulus and your attention is grabbed away from what you were doing. Whereas the dorsal attention network handles the former, what I talked about, while you're engaged in a task and your attention is, you're engaging your attention in a goal-directed manner. And specifically, what we're interested in, or what we were interested in these studies that I'm going to talk about, is this interplay between the two networks when something unexpected happens. When you get this very salient cue and your attention is grabbed, what ends up happening is the ventral attention network becomes active and suppresses the dorsal attention network, which allows you to disengage with the task that you're currently doing and then engage with this novel stimulus. The suppression of the dorsal attention network by the ventral attention network is really handled by this subcortical structure called the locus ceruleus. So the locus ceruleus is this brain region in the brain stem, this subcortical area, whereas these attention networks are cortical. They're on the cortex, the surface of the brain. And in response to a unexpected or very salient stimuli, what will happen is your ventral attention network will activate, and then projections from the prefrontal cortex will go down to the locus ceruleus, thereby activating it and then causing it to release norepinephrine to the brain as a whole, which rebalances the activity of these attention networks. Very conveniently, for those of us who want to study this and to study this process without actually doing any surgery or intracranial stuff, which would be both difficult and unethical in most people, is that the locus ceruleus actually projects and innervates pupil dilator muscles. So what ends up happening is when you have constant luminous and constant lighting, pupil dilations are going to be mostly driven by activations in the locus ceruleus, which gives us this nice, simplified, definitely a caveat there, but nice index of what's going on in locus ceruleus at any given time. In line with this, pupil dilations have been associated with a whole host of different cognitive capacities and facets before. For instance, you see pupil dilations in response to unexpected tones. If you're just sitting there and then a sound beeps, your pupil's going to dilate a little bit. Notably, these dilations are not driven by early sensory processing. It doesn't have to be do with the fact that you are just hearing something. It has to do with the attentional resources that are allocated to that stimulus. Also notably, and quite interesting for me, is that these dilations are related to subjective awareness. So in this attentional blink paradigm that Weirda and colleagues ran, they saw stronger pupil dilations in response to stimuli that people ended up being aware of versus ones that they ended up not being aware of. So the pupil dilations are related to subjective awareness in some way. And in addition to everything else, they also relate or have been empirically related to changes in the dorsal attention network. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to use pupil size. I've just talked about attention. We wanted to use pupil size to characterize how attention fits in with self-initiated or volitional actions. So when I say self-initiated or volitional actions, what's frequently done in these sorts of studies is sit people down in a chair in front of a computer and have them either flick their wrist or press a button at a time of their choosing. And what's often done in these sorts of studies is to look backwards from the time of movement at the neural processes and the changes in the brain that occur leading up to movement. The most commonly studied neural signal in this field is the readiness potential, this slow negative drift. It's negative because the y-axis is flipped here. This slow negative drift that occurs before a time of movement. It's been interpreted in multiple different ways, but posing some difficulty for both scientists and philosophers, the readiness potential has not been conclusively linked to any one cognitive capacity since its discovery. It seems like we see readiness potentials before movement in different conditions, sometimes even before non-motor decisions. So it's not clear what the readiness potential reflects. We wanted to do something similar to a readiness potential paradigm, but with pupil dilations, because pupil dilations, like I've said, have been really tightly linked to this one specific cognitive process. So we did that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that now. We ran a pretty classic Libet type paradigm where people are sat down in front of a computer that has a clock on it with a rotating dot. What they have to do is on every trial, they have to watch the clock and in some cases move spontaneously. And on certain trials, they would move spontaneously and not report anything. They'd just be watching the clock. They would report when they moved in some trials using the position of the dot, reporting where the dot was when they moved, or reporting when they first felt the urge to move. So these are the sort of classic conditions that are frequently used in these self-initiated paradigms. We also ran a kind of interesting condition where people had to spontaneously imagine moving rather than making a specific overt movement, because we really wanted to try and disentangle to what degree pupil dilations might be related to motor versus non-motor processes. And then finally, as a bit of a control, we had them on some trials just wait and then hear a tone and then report where the dot was at the time that the tone played. So the first one that we're going to look at is this last trial. And what we saw is that, and this has been seen in the literature many times before, we saw is that the pupil size is relatively flat. And then at time 0, when the tone begins, when it plays, a little bit after that, you see this strong pupil dilation corresponding to this reorienting of attention towards that tone. Okay, so this reorienting of attention takes place after the tone occurs and pretty reliably after the tone occurs. That led us to ask, what about in self-initiated action? When would the dilation, or what would go on in terms of pupil dilations, and when would they begin? What we found is when we had people move spontaneously but not report anything, we saw these antecedent pupil dilations where the pupil was flat and then began dilating somewhere in the half a second to second range before movement. This dilation continues and gradually ramps up before movement and then peaks a little bit after movement and then dies off. So we did this and it was quite interesting. We weren't sure what to make of it. We presented some initial results, pilot results at a different conference, and someone told us about this study way back in the 80s, which as far as we know is the only one that's looked at these dilations. And what they found is giving people different weights to move, different demands on the motor execution. They found that they found one, antecedent pupil dilations, but two, they found that the ramp up, what's happening before the time of movement, didn't depend on the motor activity. It didn't depend on the motor demands. The only change that they saw in terms of the motor demands happened after the movement. So this early ramp up seems to have less to do with the movement itself and more to do with the what's going on in terms of the attentional system. So let's take a look at the other conditions that we ran. We wanted to see if introducing these other reporting conditions leading to different demands on cognition would change these early ramp ups. And what we saw was that, largely speaking, they really didn't. These differences between the conditions before the time of movement were very small and not significant. So in basically every condition, the pupil continues to be pretty flat until around a second or half a second before movement. And then we see this strong dilation going through the time of movement. And we think that this really reflects this internally driven attention reorienting process. Again, there's nothing happening, nothing's changing on screen or in the participant's external environment at the time that these pupil dilations begin. Instead, we think that this dilation corresponds to something happening in their brain, which then drives this attention reorienting process. Okay. Now, notably, we characterized when these dilations began for individual subjects and correlated them against various behavioral results, like when they reported having the urge to move, when they reported actually moving, and so on. And for all of them, but especially notably W time, or when they reported having the urge to move, there's no relation between when the dilation began and the reported time of having an urge to move. So this seems to be some sort of attention-related process that is pretty consistent or independent of the reporting demands, and also occurs for imagined movements. So it doesn't seem to be requiring an actual movement at the time of alignment. So a little bit of an interim study before I move on to some of the next questions, but we found antecedent pupil dilations, and we think that they reflect this internally driven activation of locus coeruleus, which reflects attention reorienting, or this, again, internally driven attention reorienting before a self-initiated movement. Notably, the dilations begin around 500 milliseconds before movement, which is both earlier than the reported time that subjects said that they were aware of an upcoming movement or aware of an urge to move, but it doesn't correlate on a single subject level with that reported time of movement or reported time of an urge to move. It also didn't report with the time of movement either, so technically that was true. So that describes what's going on in terms of this attention reorienting process before movement, before self-initiated actions. Now I want to talk about how attention might relate to the neural correlates of volition and volitional actions. Okay, so to this end, we ran a second experiment where we incorporated both pupillometry and EEG at the same time. So because we didn't see differences between the reporting conditions, we decided to simplify and just have them press a button whenever they felt like it on most normal trials. We added a special caveat, though, that on some trials, they would be interrupted by a tone before they have a chance to move. In response to this tone, they would have to suppress any movement that they were generating. So they would have to not move if they were going to move, but also not move if they were not going to move. And then tell us, when the tone occurred, were they preparing to move? Okay. So the first trial is going to be useful for linking these antecedent pupil dilations to things like the readiness potential, these neural correlates of volitional actions. And then the second trial we're going to use to talk about self-control, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. So what we see is that the antecedent pupil dilations begin well after the readiness potential begins in aggregate. Okay, the readiness potential begins somewhere in the -2 to -3 seconds range in this study. We had some subjects who had particularly early ones, but historically the readiness potential begins somewhere in the -1 to -2 range. And this is well before the antecedent dilations that we observe begin. So readiness potential comes first. What we wanted to do next was to link pupil size and these antecedent dilations to brain activity on individual trials. But raw EEG is not really a great single trial measure. So what we did instead is we looked at the brain activity and EEG at specific frequency bands. So raw EEG can be broken down into oscillations happening at different frequencies. So you have slower frequency oscillations, which are called the delta and theta bands, and then faster frequency oscillations, which are called alpha and then beta and then gamma bands as you increase in oscillation frequency. So what we did is we wanted to look at things like, okay, how big has the pupil gotten? How much has it dilated before movement versus how much activity is there? What is the amplitude of the oscillations in these different frequency bands? Because the different frequency bands have been linked to different cognitive processes, just in the literature. So here we've just plotted the amplitude of the different frequency bands or different frequencies as color across time. So leading up to the time of movement, and then at different frequencies. If you're not following this graph, that's okay. It's a little bit in depth. This is mostly here, I think, for the EEG people among us. But what we see is that you see this decrease in power in very low frequencies leading up to the time of movement, then an increase in what is mostly in the theta band a little bit after the time of movement, and then before movement, you see this decrease in the high alpha and beta bands. Okay. I should note that all of this is at CZ. So what we did is we just took the average power in the different frequency bands in the 500 milliseconds before movement and correlated that using hierarchical linear models, which take into account single trial data. And we just correlated the pupil size, the z-scored, against the oscillation amplitudes to try and characterize, okay, what are these pupil dilations related to and what are they not related to? One of the things that's been well studied in this field is beta desynchronization, or a decrease in beta power, or the strength of these beta oscillations leading up to the time of movement. This has been well replicated and found extensively historically, although has received, I think, a little bit less attention than the RP. But we didn't find any relation between the pupil dilations and the activity in the beta bands in the 500 milliseconds before movement, which kind of makes sense because the beta desynchronization has been linked, I think, to motor preparation more than more cognitive types of processing. And so, like what we found before, it seems that the pupil dilations are not so much related to the motor preparation, but more cognitive capacities. And in line with that, we looked at changes in the gamma frequency leading up to the time of movement. Gamma has been associated with more cognitive types of processing before. And although it's a modest p-value and a pretty modest strength correlation, we did find a negative relationship between pupil size and gamma power in the 500 milliseconds before movement. So it seems like the more the pupil is dilated, the less gamma power there is right before movement. Okay. And again, or I should clarify, this is preliminary. These are uncorrected p-values because we don't have too much data and everything would just be gone if we did correct. But I include this because we found this not just at CZ, but also at frontal electrodes. We looked at this both at CZ and F1. So it seems like there is this general relation between these pupil dilations and gamma before movement. So that is a little bit on how this attention reorienting process and these antecedent dilations relate to the neural correlates of volition. Now I want to finally get at, I think, what Polaris has been waiting for, which is how attention relates to self-control. So like I mentioned before, we had these two types of trial. They were randomly distributed. It was completely up to chance if someone would press before a tone occurred or if the tone would occur before they had the chance to move. And we timed it so it was about 50-50 either of those cases. But what we had, again, was in the probe trial, they would have to not move when the probe occurred. Okay, so this gives us a situation where there's a conflict between what they were going to do and what they now have to do based on the task, where the success in that successful resolution of that conflict requires inhibitory control. It requires inhibition of their movements. Okay. And I'll come back to the question of whether or not they were preparing to move. So what we wanted to do here is look at activity in the frontal theta bands, frontal activity in the theta bands, because theta oscillations in frontal regions have previously been linked to inhibitory control. So we wanted to see if there was any relation between attention indexed by these pupil dilations and pupillometry and inhibitory control indexed by theta oscillations, frontal theta oscillations. So we first looked at theta oscillations when people said, oh yeah, I was preparing to move, versus when they said they were not preparing to move after the tone has occurred. And these differences were not significant. So it's zoomed in a lot, which leads to some differences between the lines, but there was no significant difference between theta oscillations when people said they were preparing to move when the tone occurred versus when they said, oh no, I wasn't preparing to move when the tone occurred. What we then did is we ran a linear mixed effects model taking into account pupil size in the second after the probe, as well as theta power in the second after the probe. And we related them to each other on a single trial level, taking into account the condition. So when whether subjects said that they were preparing to move or if they said that they were not preparing to move. Now, when subjects said that they weren't preparing to move, that nothing special was going on when the probe occurred, there's no relation between the pupil size after the probe and theta oscillations, okay? However, when people said that they were preparing to move when the probe occurred, we found that there was a significant positive correlation between the evoked pupil dilations and the theta power occurring after the probe. Okay. So again, I want to say this is preliminary. I'm really excited to share all of this with you, but this is still preliminary work. We're still gathering subjects, but it does suggest something interesting about the relation between attention and inhibitory self-control, which is that attention influences the signatures of inhibitory control, these frontal theta oscillations, specifically when there's something to inhibit. Okay. I want to note that this is actually backed up by a couple of other studies in the literature, not on volitional action, but on go, no-go paradigms that have linked pupil dilations and go, no-go paradigms to theta power, reflecting inhibition, which again, suggests that attention plays this really key role in our ability to control ourselves in the presence of, well, competing either motivations for proper philosophical self-control, or at least in this case, in terms of competing task demands. Okay, so we covered these 4 questions during this talk, or at least during my half of the talk, but also during Polaris's. What is attention? We talked about the different attentional networks and this reorienting process that involves the locus ceruleus. In terms of attention fitting in with self-initiated and volitional actions, we talked about these antecedent pupil dilations that emerge before movement, but don't correlate with classic measures like W time. We found that these antecedent dilations correlate with gamma power, but not beta power at CZ. And finally, we found out that the evoked dilations by this probe related to theta oscillations, but only when people said they were preparing a movement, not when they said they weren't preparing a movement. Okay. So I think I can skip over that since I think we're running out of time. Just giving a brief overview of both of our talks, Polaris talked about the role of attentional processes in self-control, and I talked about the role of attentional processes mostly in volition, but then in this basic model of self-control. And in the future, I think more work will need to be done to come up with a well-controlled paradigm that really includes a motivational conflict rather than a task conflict, to see if these claims about attention and self-control hold up empirically. Yeah, and so now I think it's good to open it for the Q&A. If you'd like to contact us, there are me and Polaris's emails. And I wanted to say thank you to everyone at the lab who helped with this study, both of these studies, and especially Uri Maus, Aaron Sugar, and Tomasz Dominik, who met with me separately to go over this presentation and the interpretations therein. Polaris, who has been great in discussing these ideas and interpreting these results. Tim for also helping us organize this and giving us feedback on our ideas, and way too many others to list here. The font would be too small and no one would be able to read anything anyway. So with that, I'd like to open it for the Q&A. Thank you.
Fantastic, Jake. Thanks very much, Jake and Polaris. That's really great. Let me kick off the Q&A. I'll read out Hazel's question for Jake. I might have missed this. Was there a control to make sure that the probe didn't occur as the subject was moving? What happened if it did? And I'll let you answer that, and then we'll get to some of the hands that have been raised. I saw Till, then Walter, then Liad. We're going to be here for a long time.
Yeah. So there wasn't a specific control to make sure that it didn't occur while they were moving. What we did is, if they pressed the button after the probe occurred, we just categorized those as failure to inhibit trials, and it allowed us to separate out trials where people were so close to moving that they wouldn't be able to stop themselves at the time of the probe. Okay, so we basically omitted all trials where whatever inhibitory control process people tried to use, they weren't successful. So there was either successful inhibition of movement or non-successful inhibition of non-movement, I guess is the most complicated way to say that I could come up with. Does that make sense?
We'll get a follow-up if it doesn't, but that sounds certainly a good start. Mm-hmm. Till.
Thank you both. Both were really, really interesting. I have too many questions, but I'll start with one for Polaris, or one very little one. So I didn't quite understand that. So that's a question of understanding why we should expect that the different strategies would cancel out. Why couldn't it be that some strategies are just simply much more effective? In fact, I think that's what we find, that, for example, situational control is much more effective than inhibitory control. So I was wondering why you thought that we should expect that they cancel out. And then another question on the saliency reduction. So again, in situational strategies, it wasn't quite clear to me why we should expect that Q saliency reduction necessarily needs to matter. So because obviously, one thing that you can do if you, for example, avoid the situation is that Q reduction, or if you can obviously also target something like an Ulysses paradigm, well, Ulysses, as an example, you target your ability to move rather than your ability to decide. Would you say that's then not self-control? And in reconstruction, you are concentrating on the stimulus. You make it even more salient, but salient in a different way, maybe in a disgusting way, for example. Okay, that's so many questions already. So I'll leave the other one for if there's time.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Till. I like these questions and I would like to stay up all night talking about them, but we need to be considerate to others. So I'll just try to be as brief as I can. So with regards to Q salience reduction in situational strategies, and why does it matter? Well, it matters in terms of, I suppose, in terms of finding out whether there is something that is mechanistically similar about situational strategies and intrapsychic strategies. Because you're right, the various strategies of self-control, I think it would be an overstatement to say that they cancel each other out totally. What we would instead expect is that we would have so if we had a pool of self-control strategies that somewhat cancel each other out, then what we would end up having is less pronounced interpersonal differences in self-control. But we instead have quite pronounced differences. And so that fascinates me. And I do think that part of that is because, just as you said, that some strategies are more effective than others. And some strategies are more suitable for more people than others. So there might be very effective strategies that not everybody can use. But also, I've wondered whether there is also similarities, particularly in terms of thinking in terms of people with executive functioning difficulties, for whom, in terms of strategies, situational strategies should work great for them, and they do. But actually enacting situational strategies and learning them can be quite hard, even for people with those for the difficulties. Particularly for people with those difficulties, so that they have more difficulties in enacting situational strategies than controls. So even as situational strategies are a better fit than for people with executive functioning difficulties, than intrapsychic strategies are, and they experience better success in terms of those, they still don't get to baseline, so to speak. So I was wondering about why that is. And then given that executive functioning difficulties are also associated, and it's a broad construct, it's a vague construct. I have a range of problems with the construct of executive functioning, but given its associations with attention modulation, then it could help us explain why it is that the same people who struggle with intrapsychic strategies also struggle with setting up situational strategies. Okay, so that's roughly my thinking. And in terms of Q salience reduction for situational strategies, I do think that the success of situational strategies can be explained more simply. But what it does give us, it gives us a way to analyze these various strategies of self-control in a manner that has more than just the functional definition in common, so that we have more uniting these various forms of self-control than just the behavioral upshot. We have something about the process leading up to it, uniting them as well. And you discovered the one counterexample that I mentioned that we could talk about in the Q&A. So the Ulysses case, in which Ulysses, obviously, for him, the Song of the Sirens is entirely salient to him, and he does nothing to modulate Q salience. So instead, he blocks acting on it with this ingenious strategy that prevents his moving at all. So that, I think, is an example of how we can do something that fulfills this functional definition of self-control without operating on Q salience. But these real Ulysses strategies that really entirely prohibit acting on that cue are extremely rare in everyday life. We're more likely to do something that makes it more difficult or less salient, and typically both at once. So in that sense, I think while the case of Ulysses strategies blocks me from saying that this is a universal feature of self-control, I'd still say that modulating cue salience does seem to be a feature of self-control that unites most self-control, and there are only marginal cases like the case of Ulysses and the sirens, which I think everybody agrees is extraordinary. That's why it's in a Homeric epic, that count as outliers from that characterization. I hope that helped a little bit.
Perhaps you can follow up Till later with Polaris. Let's go back to the chat, and then we'll go back to the as it were live questions. I'm going to read out a question that I take it is directed more towards Jake than Polaris, from Seneca Kuntz. Did you find any differences in inhibition of return between tasks that were simpler versus more difficult? Were there distinguishing results that may have suggested that the LC no-repi system was activated in a tonic mode versus a phasic mode? Jake, do you want to answer that? I mean, it would be cruel to pass that off to Polaris, I take it.
I think it would be. So yeah, I think that the main distinction between tonic and phasic locus coeruleus activity is that the overall level of activity, this tonic activation, has more to do with arousal, whereas the moment-to-moment changes in locus coeruleus activity have more to do with attention. They have, like, super simplified. Now, we only did the one task. So there weren't different demands on inhibition or different things besides, the demands that participants experienced based on what stage of the motor preparation process they were in when the probe occurred. But one of the two papers that I included there that did look at pupilometry and theta oscillations in a go-no-go task manipulated the go-no-go task behaviorally. So on some trials, most of the cues were go, and then there were some rare no-go trials. And in other cases, most of the trials were no-go, and there were few go trials. And what they found was that the pupil dilations that were evoked in the no-go cases were linked to theta oscillations only when the most of the trials were go. So in orders, you really had this prepotent response to act, and then you really had to try and stop yourself, as opposed to the other case where the default thing to do is to not act, a non-action, and in the rare cases, you have to start an action. So for them, they found the link between pupilometry or pupil dilations and theta power in the when demands on inhibition were high, basically. In terms of the phasic versus tonic, we looked at the pupil dilations themselves as opposed to just overall pupil size. So we think that these are related to the pupil shifts in pupil size, and not just overall pupil size, because that has historically been linked to just overall power. But we found various cases where the pupil size was linked to decreased power. Does that make sense?
Over to you, Walter.
So I was actually going to ask a question very close to Till's, but now I want to go back to Polaris's response to Till. I don't think those types of Ulysses strategies are at all rare. I think, if I've got drugs at home and I don't want to use them, I throw them down the toilet. If I am at a bar and I don't want to drive home because I might be drunk, I give my keys to the bartender. If I'm on a trip with my wife and I don't want to play golf because I know it's going to annoy her, I leave my golf clubs at home. I think a lot of times, it's not rare at all for us to control ourselves by making us unable to do something that we know we shouldn't be doing, even though we, might still be paying attention to it. I'm just wondering why you think that's so rare, because it strikes me as very common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so why I think it's rare is that I think strictly Ulysses arrangements, like the one of Ulysses in this epic, amount to making it absolutely impossible to follow that cue. So you're making a foolproof plan. Ulysses has wax in the sailor's ears and he's tied to the mast. It's a foolproof plan. Whereas for most of the Ulysses type arrangements, we do in daily life, like chucking out that liquor that we don't want to drink, they just make things a little bit more difficult to attain. So if I chug out any liquor I have in an effort not to drink, then I have to make a trip to the store. And likewise with drugs, then I might have to make a trip to my dealer. So it's not a foolproof plan the way it is for Ulysses. And then if I engage in that, like chugging out the drugs or liquor in an effort to quit, then what I end up with when that urge or desire strikes me is having to deal with the salience of that urge, and having to balance, of course, there's an increased effort to fulfilling that desire. There's also then one thing that not having that in the house is it doesn't just make it easier to have a substance that's in the house, but it's also more salient because it's right there. And then getting it out of the house makes it both more difficult and less salient. But it's not a foolproof plan the way it is for Ulysses. So that's why I think it's rare. We rarely do a foolproof plan.
I guess, let me just a quick follow-up. I think that's not really fair, because in Ulysses, it was a particular occasion when he was not fair. If my dealer's not around and I don't want to take drugs tonight because the people I'm with won't like it, and I flush the only ones I have down the toilet, I'm completely unable to take them tonight. Even though you're right, in the future, I might be able to track down my dealer. I might have stopped myself on the occasion, just like Ulysses.
Yeah, I grant that. So we definitely do sometimes do those kinds of arrangements. But what I'm trying to say is that most of the self-control that we engage in is not of that character. So those are the sorts of stories that they stick in our minds. We remember them afterwards. Like, that's the night when I did that to avoid taking drugs that night. Whereas in our daily back and forth between writing papers and having other various desires, whichever the hierarchies of those desires happen to be, we typically use much softer means for that. So I think maybe we both can more or less agree that it's still a minority of self-control that's of this character. But I do grant that it does happen sometimes outside of Homeric epics and in our lives, but not on a daily basis and not as frequently as the salience-based self-control modes do.
Thanks, Polaris. Liad.
Yes, so thank you both for the very interesting and thought-provoking talks. I have two questions for Jake. One is more methodological and the other theoretical. So the first, I might have gotten this wrong, but it seemed to me like there is some inverse inference in the argument, in the sense that you want to persuade us that attention has a role in the process, and you use the pupil dilation in order to make that inference. And I wonder if it couldn't be another process, because we know that the pupil reacts to cognitive load and task demands and temporal expectations. And in the Libet tasks, for sure, people are, at least when I did it, people are kind of keeping track of time. So couldn't that be something that is unrelated to attention? That's the first question. And the second, more theoretical one is, let's assume that it is attention. What do you think is attention's role in the process? Like, does it help you resolve, like reach a decision? What is the mechanistic function that you would assign to that?
Yeah, great. I think these are both really big and cool questions to both think and talk about. In the first one, on the relation between pupil dilations and attention, whether or not it's some other cognitive capacity, I think that for a long time, pupillometry has been linked to different cognitive capacities and different things, but I think mostly that has been because of the locus coeruleus's role in modulating attention and arousal, which factors into a wide variety of capacities and a wide variety of cognitive processes. So like you said, temporal expectation, you're going to have some role of attention and arousal in, well, I've thought less about arousal, but you're going to have some role of attention in expecting something. To expect something, you need to, well, maybe I shouldn't claim that you need to, I haven't thought about this too much, but I think you'd need to attend to something in order to expect it. And so I think that attention would definitely play a role there. In terms of why we think that this reflects a reorienting process specifically and not something else, is that the magnitude of the dilations was remarkably similar to what we saw in evoked by the tone. So the change in pupil size between the baseline and the peak was similar to, actually like very close to what we saw as evoked by the tone. And so that at least is a little bit more suggesting that this is a reorienting process. And I will definitely say there's been a lot of evidence coming out that pupil size is a one-dimensional representation of supposedly a brain region that has tens of thousands of neurons. It's not going to capture everything, and there are other influences on it. But I think that, and these questions will have to be answered later, and with more tightly controlled paradigms, specifically looking at that. But I think that there is some evidence that it is reflecting reorienting, or at the very least, this recruitment of locus coeruleus in response to some internal change. And your second question was, what was your second question?
What would be the mechanism by which attention?
So the way that I'm thinking about this, there's sort of two ways to think about this, I think. And I think about both of them in terms of the drift diffusion model. The first is that there's some sort of ongoing coupling between fluctuations in the drift diffusion model and the attentional systems, or PFC, which projects down to locus coeruleus. And we would see these dilations because either they're driven in part by the drift diffusion model, and maybe they play some sort of reciprocal role with the brain activity. So pupil dilations and attention have been linked to noise reduction previously. One of the things that has been found recently in this field is reduced variance of the readiness potential leading up to the time of movement. And so it might play a role there. But I'm still split between whether or not they're, oh, and then the second option is that the pupil dilations are a result of some threshold crossing, for instance, by something like a drift diffusion process. And frankly, I'm not sure which of those are the right answer. I have some ideas for analyses that I've yet to do, which might suggest one or the other, but I'm not prepared to say one versus the other right now.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for the questions. Those are really good.
Thanks, Jake. And Patrick Haggard.
Hello, can you hear me? It's a new laptop, so
yep.
I don't know if it's working.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much for these nice presentations. It's very nice to hear pupil data, and well done for finding the study of Richer and Beattie 1985, which has been largely sunk without trace, and that helps with a lot of non-reinvention of wheels.
Well, really quickly, Patrick, you were the one who told us about that at the conference several years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
I do remember, my memory is not super good, but I do remember us talking perhaps about some very preliminary data. So good to see that work being used. And I think my comment is really about latency. So you showed an interesting graph where you showed that the RP begins long before the antecedent dilation. And that's certainly true. But I think part of that is just the sluggish output response of the pupillary control system. And it reminds us that everything that whenever we do chronometry, we're typically trying to line up two things. And each of the things that we're trying to line up has a time constant, or it's got a frequency response, so it acts as a filter, and it's also got a delay. And the delay in the pupil is big. So if you look at the characteristic descent into positivity of the RP, there's an almost very similar pupillary constriction or relative constriction, which typically happens around a second later. In your data, it was a bit less. It was more like 0.6, 0.7 seconds. But just the output that you're measuring is sluggish. So I just thought that this reminded me of how fraught chronometric comparisons are. I think it's really quite tricky saying that one thing begins earlier or later than another when the things in question have this kind of apple and versus orange different dynamics. That's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and suggests it does add some. There's, I think, also, so in addition to there being temporal uncertainty and when the pupil dilations begin because of the lag between locus coeruleus activation and the pupillary response, there is also uncertainty in terms of the constant of norepinephrine release. So norepinephrine is a slow-acting neurotransmitter. It's not going to have an immediate, strong effect on neural circuits. I mean, enough of it will, but it is a slow-acting neurotransmitter. That said, there was this nice study recently by, it's Podvalny et al. It was eLife. I can't remember the lab that it came from. But they looked at pupil size at rest and how that correlates against activity of different frequency bands in all of the different resting state networks. And they found a peak correlation when the pupil size lagged the brain activity by about 400 milliseconds. So that is probably more the outcome of pupil size and not the cause of changes in pupil size. But 400 milliseconds versus the RPs that we found were maybe second and a half versus 2 seconds, or second and a half to 2 seconds. So I think that the margin of error is wide enough to claim that the RP onset comes first, and then we start seeing these pupil dilations. But you're right, it's nowhere near, there is still a caveat there that needs to be mentioned. You're right.
Oh, we've pretty much reached the end of our allotted time, so I think I'll wrap things up there. Please join with me in thanking Polaris and Jake for a fascinating talk, a real wonderful example of how the philosophy and the neuroscience can work together and illuminate each other. And obviously, you've got their contact details. They're findable on the internet if you want to follow up any issues with them. Thanks also to Tian and Uri for helping put on this series of talks. Is this the last one, or are there any more?
This is the last one, at least in this competition. We may end up having another one later in the year. We'll look into that. Thank you, everyone who joined us for these. I found them very exciting. I hope you did too. Thank you, Tim, for guiding this one. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Polaris, and goodbye for this one.